They will tell you waste is a side chore. They will tell you that food, water, and shelter are the real priorities. They will tell you a camp fails from the outside. Raiders, storms, starvation. They are wrong. Camps collapse from within, and it begins with the same mistake every civilian-turned-survivor makes. They treat waste like garbage instead of recognizing it as a rapidly mutating biological threat. The old world trained people to ignore it. Municipal grids, sewage lines, weekly collection trucks. They hid the cost of entropy behind engineered distance. Now that those systems are dead, the truth is exposed. Waste is not passive. Waste is active decay. It ferments, spreads, infiltrates, and consumes every undisciplined camp that underestimates its reach. A long-term post-collapse settlement is not defeated by scarcity. It is defeated by contamination, parasites, waterborne vectors, methane pockets, and the slow but absolute breakdown of internal hygiene. Survivors fear the dark perimeter, yet the real enemy grows meters behind them in the shadows of their own routines. The world no longer forgives miscalculations. Every gram of unmanaged waste becomes a potential chain reaction that compromises water sources, soil integrity, food security, and respiratory safety. The equation is simple: control entropy or be consumed by it. Waste management is not maintenance. It is a survival weapon, a strategic firewall, and one of the few systems that determines whether a camp evolves into a long-term stronghold or dissolves into rot. In the post-apocalyptic timeline, you don't handle waste. You dominate it. That is the doctrine. Containment is not a structure. It is a perimeter-level philosophy, and it separates a temporary camp from a long-term base capable of resisting internal collapse. The first tool is not a shovel, a barrel, or a rope. It is the containment triad framework, a system that imposes order on decay before decay imposes disorder on you. Most survivors fail here because they still behave like short-term nomads, scattering their waste zones wherever convenience dictates. That mindset is lethal. Waste gravitates, spreads, absorbs moisture, attracts vectors, and bleeds into the environment unless you impose geometry on it. The triad forces that geometry into existence through three simultaneous controls: isolation, sealing, and zoning. Isolation is the uncompromising separation of waste from living space. Camps must understand distance not as comfort, but as biological insulation. Every meter gained is a variable removed from the contamination equation. Sealing is the act of denying oxygen, denying moisture, and denying movement. Improvised lids, weighted covers, tar seal layers, and pressure barriers prevent the biochemical chain reactions that turn contained waste into an airborne threat. Zoning transforms scattered disposal habits into a dedicated waste district, one that every member of the camp recognizes as a restricted operational zone. When these three components align, you create a psychological firewall as much as a physical one. Survivors stop treating waste casually because the architecture itself enforces discipline. A camp without containment is a camp already forfeiting its future. A camp with it has taken the first irreversible step toward long-term resilience because it acknowledges an uncomfortable truth. Survival is not about gathering resources, but about preventing your own waste from becoming a weapon pointed inward. The human waste conversion vault is the first true test of whether a camp intends to survive years rather than months. It is where instinct collides with engineering, where discomfort must be replaced with protocol, and where human waste, normally dismissed with disgust, becomes a controlled biochemical process that strengthens the camp instead of poisoning it. This system is not a pit latrine, not a hole in the ground, and not a bucket hidden behind a tarp. Those are artifacts of short-term thinking. The vault is a deliberate, multi-stage structure engineered to neutralize pathogens, suppress vectors, protect groundwater, and convert biological risk into agricultural potential. Most survivors fail because they assume waste decomposition is automatic. It isn't. Pathogens require heat thresholds. Parasites require isolation windows. Viral remnants demand time, dryness, and anaerobic phases. The vault enforces all of these variables through thermal mass layering, carbon-rich dry matter, controlled oxygen access, moisture regulation, and the elevation of internal temperatures to the pathogen kill zone. This transforms the vault into a slow-burning engine of biological stability. Groundwater contamination, the silent killer of post-collapse camps, is eliminated through raised containment walls, bottom seals, and controlled drainage channels that divert runoff far from the camp's hydrological footprint. In the old world, wastewater plants handled these dangers invisibly. Now, you build that capability yourself, or you pay in infection, dehydration, and burial mounds. Over months, the vault converts the most hazardous output a human body produces into fertile, pathogen-free compost that can regenerate soil and extend the lifespan of your food production system. Waste becomes resource, decay becomes infrastructure, and survival shifts from reactive to regenerative. This is the moment the camp stops being temporary. A long-term camp eventually discovers a brutal truth. Firewood is finite, muscle energy is limited, and every calorie spent gathering fuel is a calorie stolen from your survival buffer. This is where most settlements plateau and then degrade. They assume heat is a constant and fuel is a given. It isn't. The biodigestion heat unit exists to break that dependency by transforming organic waste into a pressurized, stable, renewable source of methane, an energy asset that operates silently, invisibly, and without exposing the camp to perimeter detection risks. This tool is not a barrel of rotting scraps. It is an engineered anaerobic environment where microbial colonies operate like microscopic laborers, converting decay into fuel with mathematical reliability. The unit thrives only under conditions of total oxygen exclusion, controlled moisture, and internal temperature stability, and this is where most survivors fail. They treat digesters like compost piles and then wonder why they implode, leak, or attract vectors. The unit demands precision, airtight seals, weighted lids, one-way gas valves, and a dedicated feed protocol that maintains microbial balance. Too much green waste starves the system of structure. Too much carbon stalls the colony. Too much water suffocates it. Discipline is the price of efficiency. As methane builds, the digester becomes a pressurized reservoir, a volatile one if mishandled. Pressure regulation is non-negotiable, and survivors must understand that methane is not a toy flame, but a compressed threat that rewards respect and punishes negligence. Safe vent lines, cooling coils, and distance from living quarters turn this system from a hazard into a tactical advantage. When managed correctly, the output is clean-burning fuel that powers stoves, sterilizes tools, boils water, and heats shelters without the smoke signature that gives away your presence. In a world where sound and light discipline dictate survival, flameless heat from captured methane becomes a strategic asset. What makes the unit transformative is not just the energy it produces, but the cycle it closes. Organic waste that would otherwise rot, attract vectors, or compromise camp hygiene instead becomes part of the camp's energy infrastructure. Every meal generates fuel. Every piece of plant refuse becomes thermal potential. The camp stops relying on the outer world and begins generating its own energy from its own entropy. Waste becomes power. Decay becomes fire. And the camp transitions from consuming the landscape to operating as a self-fueled organism. This is the moment when a settlement stops fearing long-term survival and starts engineering it. The biodigestion heat unit is not comfort, it is sovereignty. Every camp produces debris, cloth scraps, infected rags, broken packaging, pest-ridden fibers, and the slow accumulation of materials that no longer serve their original purpose. In the old world, these items disappeared into landfills or incinerators managed by distant systems. After the collapse, they linger, absorb moisture, host parasites, and become a silent conduit for disease transfer. This is where most survivors repeat a fatal pattern. They burn waste in open flames, announcing their location with smoke plumes visible for kilometers. Or they bury it shallow, creating fermentation pockets that rupture after storms. Both choices are signals of a camp that still thinks like civilians instead of operators. The dry matter reduction kiln exists to shatter that mindset. This system is not a bonfire. It is a controlled high-temperature incineration chamber engineered to eliminate dry waste without producing detectable signatures. Its structure is deceptively simple. A double-walled thermal shell, narrow intake channels, insulated stone or steel lining, and a forced draft chimney that consumes smoke before it escapes. When heat circulates inside the kiln, waste doesn't burn with flame. It carbonizes. The process is silent, smokeless, and decisive. Cloth fibers collapse into sterile ash. Larvae, spores, and parasites die at temperatures that never breach the external visibility threshold. Even contaminated medical debris can be neutralized without leaving a chemical scent. This is the true power of the kiln. Discretion. A camp that controls its heat and hides its waste becomes a camp no one can track. But the kiln is more than a disposal unit. It is a material refinery. High-temperature reduction transforms certain waste, cloth, wood shavings, plant residues, into biochar instead of ash, a resource that purifies water, enhances soil retention, and feeds filtration systems. What once threatened the camp's health now strengthens its infrastructure. Meanwhile, the absence of smoke allows night operations, stealth cleanups, and the complete sterilization of objects so sensitive they cannot be stored, composted, or repurposed. A camp that builds a kiln is a camp that understands a fundamental post-collapse law. Waste must vanish without a trace. Not reduced, not hidden, erased. Because visibility is vulnerability, and contamination is collapse. The dry matter reduction kiln is the tool that ensures neither ever occurs. Metal and glass are the last survivors of the old world, materials that do not rot, do not decay, and do not surrender to weather or time. They remain long after plastic breaks down, wood molds, and fabric disintegrates. Most camps misjudge them as junk, forgetting that in a post-collapse ecosystem, durability is currency. The metal and glass salvage loop exists to convert that currency into control. It is not scavenging. It is extraction, classification, and reforge, an industrial logic executed without an industry. The first shift is psychological. You stop seeing bottles, cans, broken panels, jar lids, wire fragments, shattered mirrors, and rusted tools as trash. You recognize them as raw stock. Every fragment is potential structure, insulation, containment, reflection, or edge. The loop begins by imposing order on chaos. Glass is separated by thickness and clarity. Metal is sorted by ferrous and non-ferrous properties. Even shards are collected in sealed pouches because fragmentation is not useless. It is tactical. Glass shards become perimeter alarms or barbed obstacles. Metal fragments become patch plates, fuel for micro-forges, components for traps, or conductive surfaces for improvised solar arrays. When camps skip this classification phase, they cripple their own self-reliance. The loop's second phase is transformation. Ferrous metal becomes reinforcement brackets, pot hooks, stove grates, digging blades. Aluminum becomes lightweight cookware or reflector panels that concentrate solar heat. Copper becomes wiring, grounding rods, pulse leads for battery banks. Glass becomes lenses, water purification funnels, or melted into crude but functional panels. Reforging doesn't require a full forge, only focused heat, controlled airflow, and a willingness to reshape what the old world abandoned. Survivors learn quickly that metal responds to discipline and temperature, not machinery. The final phase is reintegration, returning reforged components into the camp's operational structure. The loop is closed not because nothing is wasted, but because every cycle converts decay into capability. A broken jar becomes a solar ignition tool. A rusted can becomes a protective sheath. A snapped blade becomes two smaller blades. This system allows a camp to reduce dependency on chance finds and to evolve from scavengers into manufacturers, however primitive. A settlement capable of running a metal and glass salvage loop is not surviving the collapse, it is outgrowing it. This is how you build continuity, by turning the ruins of the old world into the architecture of the new one. Water is never just water in a post-collapse environment. Every drop that touches dishes, bodies, tools, or food preparation becomes greywater. A vector dense with fats, oils, microbes, and chemical residues that will infiltrate soil, poison ground supplies, and attract pests if released without control. Camps that ignore this reality slowly poison themselves from beneath, watching their water sources turn cloudy, their soil sour, their filtration units clog, and their health spiral into recurring infection cycles they cannot diagnose. The greywater extraction tower exists to break that spiral by transforming contaminated discharge into reclaimed utility-grade liquid through gravity, filtration depth, and biochemical capture. It is not a bucket filter. It is not a let it soak through the sand civilian method. It is vertical engineering built for a world without second chances. The tower stands as a narrow column. Stone, metal, timber, whatever the environment allows, packed with layers that each perform a specific biochemical function. The upper strata capture solids, oils, and organic particulates. The mid-level strata strip pathogens through charcoal adsorption, mineral binding, and aerated flow disruption. The lowest strata polish the water, forcing it through fine particulates and thermal-cooled segments that allow sediment to fall out of suspension. This architecture allows water to descend slowly in stages, forcing contaminants to surrender incrementally rather than bypass the system with speed. Every centimeter of vertical descent is a battlefield where moisture is separated from impurity. The most critical insight is this: the tower does not produce drinking water. It produces usable water. Water for washing tools, quenching compost piles, feeding methane digesters, cleaning surfaces, cooling equipment, and irrigating non-edible crops. Camps fail when they assume all water must become potable. That assumption wastes resources and contaminates potable pathways. The tower preserves the camp's primary water reserves by ensuring that gray water never re-enters the system as a threat. Instead, it is redirected, neutralized, and repurposed. Over time, as ash, charcoal, gravel, and sand layers saturate, the tower becomes a living system, one you maintain, rebuild, and harvest from. Clean charcoal is re-fired into biochar. Clogged sand becomes soil additive. Gravel is washed and recycled. Nothing is discarded without function. Wastewater becomes utility water. Utility water preserves drinking water. Drinking water preserves life. This is the chain of survival, built vertically, disciplined by gravity, and enforced by design. A camp that treats each waste management tool as an isolated solution will eventually fracture under its own inefficiencies. Systems decay when they are not connected. The closed-cycle survival ecosystem exists to eliminate that risk by binding every tool: containment, conversion, digestion, reduction, salvage, filtration, and vector suppression into one coherent operational organism. This is the moment a camp ceases functioning as a cluster of scattered human routines and begins functioning as an engineered environment, a controlled biosphere carved out of collapse. The logic is simple. No output stands alone, no byproduct is abandoned, and no material leaves the system without purpose. Entropy is reduced by eliminating leaks, blind spots, and unmanaged edges where decay infiltrates. When the containment triad holds isolation, sealing, and zoning in place, the human waste conversion vault receives feedstock that is predictable, stable, and pathogen managed. The vault's compost output feeds the soil that supports food crops. The organic refuse from those crops feeds the biodigestion heat unit, which returns methane for sterilization, heat, and cooking without perimeter signatures. The sludge effluent from the digester is cycled back into the vault or used in long-cycle compost trenches. Meanwhile, dry contaminants, cloth, medical waste, and pest-bearing fibers move to the dry matter reduction kiln, which neutralizes threats without revealing the camp's position, producing ash and biochar that feed the greywater extraction tower. Inside the tower, greywater becomes utility water. It feeds the digester. It cools solar components made from the salvage loop. It irrigates non-food biomass used to maintain the vault and kiln. Every stage supports another. Every threat becomes fuel. The metal and glass salvage loop closes structural gaps by turning abandoned materials into tools, containers, solar concentrators, and reinforcement components that keep each system in operation. Even the smallest shard or rusted plate finds a place in the network. A reflector for the digester's temperature control, a barrier panel for the containment zone, a lens for solar ignition, a bracket for tower maintenance, a trap trigger in the pest vector grid. This is integration at its most ruthless. No emotion, no nostalgia, no waste. When the pest vector suppression grid seals the perimeter, the cycle becomes airtight, preventing insects, rodents, and scavengers from injecting chaos into the ecosystem. A fully integrated camp transforms from a fragile shelter cluster into a self-sustaining machine. It produces fuel from decay, soil from waste, water from greywater, and continuity from ruins. In this closed cycle, the camp stops depending on luck and starts depending on physics, chemistry, and engineered discipline. This is survival elevated to an ecosystem, one where the collapse no longer dictates outcomes. You do. Long-term camps do not fall suddenly. They erode. They rot from within long before an external threat ever arrives. The failure patterns are consistent across regions, climates, and cultures because they are rooted in human behavior, not environment. Survivors underestimate timelines. They assume a system working today will work tomorrow. They assume pathogens move slowly. They assume vectors require visible filth. They assume their routines are good enough. These assumptions are the early fractures, hairline cracks that widen into structural collapse. The first and most predictable failure is complacency. In the early months, discipline is absolute because fear is fresh. Every process is taken seriously. Every threat feels immediate. But as routines form and the camp stabilizes, survivors begin adjusting the rules. They skip containment walks. They dump greywater closer. They feed the digester inconsistently. They leave cloth waste unburned. They tell themselves that nothing bad happened the last time, so nothing bad will happen the next time. This is the logic of decay, disguising itself as convenience. The second failure pattern is cross-contamination. Camps that do not understand flow dynamics inevitably allow their clean zones, utility zones, and waste zones to blur. The moment the vault runoff drifts toward food production soil, the clock starts ticking. The moment greywater trickles toward the freshwater reserve, the clock accelerates. The moment metal salvage is stored next to medical waste, the system loses structural integrity. Decay does not require intent. It requires proximity. Most camp collapses begin with one overlooked leak, one improperly sealed pit, one heavy rain that shifts an unprotected waste pile a few meters downhill. Survivors rarely notice until symptoms start appearing. Skin infections, stomach illness, water discoloration, crop failures. By then, the corrective cost is severe. The third failure is temporal miscalculation. Pathogens follow timelines, not human impatience. Compost requires months to neutralize danger. Kiln maintenance requires cycles. Digesters require temperature stabilization. But camps rush. They open vault chambers too early. They reuse ash too soon. They run the tower past saturation. They forget that each system is biological or chemical, not instantaneous. In the old world, technology compensated for impatience. After the collapse, impatience becomes a hazard. Correct timing is not preference. It is protocol. The final and most lethal failure is structural drift. Systems that were once aligned begin operating in isolation. A digester no longer receives enough organic feedstock. A kiln becomes a dumping hole instead of a controlled chamber. Greywater bypasses the tower because it's just this once. The salvage loop deteriorates into a junk pile. The pest vector grid collapses because traps were not reset. When systems drift apart, vulnerabilities expand between them, and these gaps become footholds for contamination, infestation, and infrastructural degradation. Corrections require one principle. Operational discipline is not a burst of effort. It is a permanent state. The camp must revisit zoning lines monthly, recalibrate feed ratios weekly, refresh tower layers on schedule, and revalidate containment distances after every storm. Survival is not the reward for initial setup. It is the reward for relentless maintenance. A long-term camp is a living organism. The moment you stop reinforcing it, it begins to die. Survival is not improvisation. It is not luck, instinct, or the naive belief that endurance alone guarantees continuity. Survival is structure, cold, engineered, and unyielding. Waste management is the final proof of this doctrine because it forces you to confront the one truth no survivor wants to acknowledge. The greatest threat to a long-term camp is not what approaches from outside, but what accumulates inside. Raiders can be repelled, storms can be endured, scarcity can be bridged, but unmanaged waste infiltrates silently, corrupts gradually, and destroys absolutely. It is the collapse happening in slow motion beneath your feet. This is why the 7 tools are not conveniences. They are strategic pillars. The containment triad enforces the discipline most camps lack. The human waste conversion vault weaponizes biology instead of succumbing to it. The biodigestion heat unit transforms decay into silent power. The dry matter reduction kiln erases threats without revealing your position. The salvage loop converts ruins into infrastructure. The greywater extraction tower shields your water logic from internal sabotage. And the pest vector suppression grid seals the perimeter, so entropy cannot breach your hard-won stability. Together, they form a doctrine: control entropy or be consumed by it. A camp that masters waste control ceases to be temporary. It becomes an ecosystem, closed, disciplined, and sovereign. Its survival is no longer dictated by chance finds, weather shifts, or seasonal scarcity. It generates its own stability, its own energy, its own soil, its own order. This is the point where survival transitions from desperation to governance, a shift from merely staying alive to establishing continuity in a world that no longer grants it. The collapse eliminated comfort, convenience, infrastructure, and the illusion of safety, but it did not eliminate the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, and strategic logic. Those laws still operate. They still reward precision, and they still punish negligence without hesitation. Waste is not an afterthought. It is the engine that determines whether your camp grows stronger or rots into failure. Master it, and you bend the post-collapse world to your will. Ignore it, and you inherit the same fate as every settlement that believed survival was a matter of hope instead of discipline. This is the final doctrine. Victory goes to the camp that eliminates its own weaknesses before eliminating any external threat. Waste is weakness only if you allow it to be. In the right hands, it becomes the backbone of a civilization rebuilt from nothing.